I have had so many examples of finding out that I'm not as good as I thought along my crochet journey. So if you're feeling that way too, I'll give you a couple of my examples and you'll know you are not alone. I was so excited when I started crocheting, and I got excited to make tons of things, and I wanted to share them with the people in my life. And I really got started with a lot of like different hats and headbands. They were pretty easy, wearable to make, or so I thought. But unfortunately, there was multiple times when the recipient of these items gave them back to me because they just didn't fit. They were ill-fitting. There were so many hats that I made for my husband that were too big or too small, and he's even right here in my house. Like, how was I messing this up? After trying out and doing a few similar type of patterns, I thought I could just wing it and come up with my own, and had disastrous results, which ended up with lots and lots of frogging, and sometimes like just getting rid of the yarn and the project altogether because it wasn't salvageable. I have tried my attempt at designing a few projects. I've even talked about them on my channel, and then halfway through or 3/4 of the way through, they totally just don't work out. It's not how I envisioned. It's not coming together right. The size is wrong. And sometimes I've made things that technically fit and work out, but sometimes because of the construction, the color, the way the color's pooled, I'm just not confident wearing it. And all of that can really leave a person feeling like they just aren't good enough. It can be like a little bit of a blow, especially if you were feeling confident prior to making this item. If this keeps happening to you, the good news is we can fix this by getting two things: practice and knowledge. So let's talk about practice first. Before you really get in and just start cranking out the projects, because that seems like progress, but if you're doing things incorrectly, you're practicing it the wrong way. So the very first thing that you need to do is really sit down and evaluate some of your recent projects. Look at them with a critical eye. Put down what you think went wrong. If you know someone else who crochets, if you're up to it and you know you can withstand a little constructive criticism, ask that person. Be like, can you help me troubleshoot this? Is there something I should be doing differently to make this fit better? Or whatever the case is. But evaluate where you're kind of going wrong and really try to be objective. I know it's hard because I think sometimes we either get overconfident or we're like crazy critical of ourselves and we think we're like the worst at everything in the world. So it is really hard to be objective as far as that goes, but really look like, where are you right now? Are you a complete beginner? Are you an advanced beginner? Are you an intermediate? Where are you on your skill level? You are definitely gonna have to devote some time to this. And I know that can seem extremely difficult to do, but if one of your goals is feeling more confident with your crochet or knit, then you will need to schedule out time and really make sure that you get that. It could be going into work and sitting in your car 15 minutes or a half an hour longer, if that's a great quiet place for you. It could be just setting your alarm and getting up before other people in your family. Maybe it's your lunch hour. It could be any number of things, but you will need to set that time aside. If you're completely happy with where you're at and you just kind of happy-go-lucky and just gradually get better, then don't worry about that as much. But if this is a goal of yours, it is going to be necessary to devote the extra time. And my advice, instead of thinking, I'm going to spend the whole weekend crocheting or the whole afternoon on Sunday or whatever, I think you're honestly going to get better results by putting in a little bit of time every day or 5 days a week. Even if you had, like I said, 15 minutes in your car in the parking lot before or after work where you could sit and do that, that 15 minutes is going to keep things fresh in your mind, and it's going to keep that momentum going. If you're looking to do it once a week and that it doesn't work out perfectly at that time, it gets pushed back another week and then another, and it could be months before you sit down to really try and work on stuff. So set aside that time. You definitely deserve it. If you're going to be doing this in your home and you've got pets or kids or roommates or anybody, you will probably need to clear out a cozy little nook that you can crochet or knit in. I recently did a video where I kind of showed how I had to convert a little corner of my living room into a crochet nook to deal with the winter weather. I will go ahead and I will link that above. There's actually a whole playlist where some other of my friends did that too. But it's just important to have that space with your stuff in it, ready to go, like as little distractions as possible. I would encourage you to find a tutor of some sort. And I'll be the first to admit it can be hard to find somebody in person to teach you to crochet or knit. I was very fortunate that a friend of mine, we were talking one day, and I had said, geez, I really wish I could learn to crochet. And she's like, I've been crocheting almost 50 years. And I was like, okay, please teach me. And she was so generous and gracious with her time, and I am so grateful for that. But years and years ago when I was in high school, I had kind of tried to have my grandma show me, and she was so great at crafting, but she wasn't super great at teaching. It was hard for her, I think, patience-wise, to watch someone struggle. And so it was just easier for her just to do it for you. So I really struggled, and I could not pick it up back then. For a lot of people, it's going to be somewhere online. It could be YouTube tutorials. And what I would encourage you to do is try out a couple different YouTubers. Like look for a certain stitch. Watch a few different videos by different creators and see who is teaching it in a way that works with your brain the best. There are some absolutely phenomenal tutorials on YouTube, and some of them have millions of views. But sometimes, just depending on your learning style and the way the person communicates, it might not be the tutorial for you. There's so much nuance in the way people explain things, and sometimes one person can explain things in a way that you just, it just clicks and you get it, while you've watched 5 other tutorials and never understood it. That's how the magic ring was for me. I struggled. I watched so many tutorials and it seemed so complicated. I tried to get my friend to show me how to do it, and I wasn't understanding her either. And then I was watching a video by this Southern girl and she was like, it is a slip knot that you don't finish. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can do it now. That clicked for me. Instead of the complicated around the fingers, come through here type of thing. So just find someone who teaches in a way that's just easier for you to understand, and then start going through their library and learning more stitches and really developing that. And just in your mind, they're like your personal tutor. Now, you definitely want to make sure you are using the right tools for the right job. And I will be the first to admit I am not a knitter, but I know there are a lot of knitters who do stop over and watch some of my content, and I appreciate that. So I want to make sure you're included. I am sure this is the exact same for you as it is for crocheters, but you need the proper size hook, and I'm sure you need the proper size needles as well. That can make such a difference on how your projects are working, and if it's working well, if your yarn is slipping off repetitively, or if you are stabbing through it and making it split. Those are all things that you could be using the wrong size. If your projects are coming out much too large, much too small, you could be using the wrong hook, and I'm assuming wrong needles as well. Check that out in any patterns or tutorials. Make sure they're the right size hook. Don't just assume that it'll be okay because it's close. That's just not, it's just asking for trouble. The next one is make sure your terminology is correct. Did you know that a double crochet is something totally different in US versus British terms? Now, a good clue might be is if the person giving the tutorial has like a fabulous British accent, that is probably a tip off that they're probably using that terminology and not US terminology. But it's not necessarily a given. You can't just assume. And I think that's safe to say too when we're dealing with tutorials that come from all sorts of places in the world, whether it's Canada or Australia, anywhere like that. Just double check to make sure that you're actually using the right terms for that pattern and project. It's very, very important that as you're trying to improve your skills and like gradually build on them, that you're picking projects that just mildly challenge you just a little bit. Like you still have that core group of skills needed for the project, but you're maybe just learning a couple different stitches or applying them differently. You do not want to pick a project that is so far advanced for your skill level that it is going to lead to immediate frustration and mistakes, and that's not a great way to learn. You're really going to disappoint yourself and you're going to feel so inadequate by picking projects that are way too advanced and aren't just mildly challenging. And finally, you want to set goals, but try to avoid making arbitrary benchmarks. What I mean by this is like saying to yourself, I want to learn 12 new stitches this year, or I want to learn, this technique in 2 weeks' time. Things like that, where there isn't really like a concrete basis for why you picked those numbers out, like you just plucked them out of the air because they sounded good. That is definitely a way to disappoint yourself and again feel very inadequate and like you're not good enough because it's not a realistic, attainable, definable goal. I actually have a whole goal sheet where I have used and broken down, and I will just take one quick minute to tell you about a new project I started. I actually put together my first digital download. It is for sale and I will have a link to it below, and it's just about like 4 or 5 different worksheets that I've created for myself, and I think they can be helpful. I have used them. I will put a video up here where I am using one of those worksheets for sure. And it's just really helped me kind of know like, what do I need to work on? What do I need to improve? What do I need to stop doing? Things like that. I just thought I would share those with you, and I'm not going to talk any more about it, but I will have a link down in the description box if that's something you're interested in. They're just like simple black and white. You can print them out. You can make 1,000,000 copies. You can put them in a binder and just kind of go over them as needed and as you're like working through the year. Moving on. Now, when it comes to improving your knowledge base, this is so, so important. And this is something that definitely has tripped me up from time to time. I love diving deep into a subject matter and learning as much about something as I can. I love a deep dive. But when it comes to fiber, there are so many fibers out there, and it's just, I feel like there's an endless supply of knowledge, and it's kind of impossible to really know everything about every fiber. So let's just talk a little bit here about the things that are really going to help you become a better crocheter or knitter and feel really confident and not be hard on yourself. Take a little bit of time and learn about some different fibers and their usage. I'm going to give you a little bit of an example of this. And this is going to be pretty basic. Let's talk about cotton, for example. A lot of people love cotton for wearables, for top. It can be very drapey, and it's a much cooler fabric than an acrylic of some sort. So knowing that a lot of clothing items are made out of cotton and it is a desirable fabric, that's a great like basic starting knowledge of what fiber to make if you're considering making a wearable for yourself. I have one or two hats made out of cotton. I don't make a lot because the fiber in itself is not very stretchy. So once it stretches out, it's kind of in that shape forever. It's not coming back. But the reason I wanted a couple is because there are times in the warmer weather where I want to wear a beanie and I want to wear a hat, and I definitely wanted it cooler and more breathable. And, I was able to make the style a lot more breathable, and with using the cotton yarn, it worked out fantastic. It's not the right fiber for everything. So really start looking at some of the yarns in your stash, or look at some of those projects that you would consider like failed projects, and look at the construction of them. See what's going on with that fiber. In my beginning days, I had made several hats out of chenille velvet yarn because I love the feel of velvet. But guess what? They never had any shape. They stretched out and didn't stretch back up, and they ended up being too big and too floppy. So it was not the right fiber for that project. And had I have used a different fiber, it probably would have turned out, but I didn't know enough at the time. Learn about yarn weights. This is going to make such a big difference for a couple different reasons. If you are messing up and the sizes of your projects are way off, you might not be using the right size of yarn for that project. Sometimes that's on us, sometimes it is on the yarn manufacturer, but ultimately it's best to know enough about yarn weights and familiarize yourself with it, that if you're looking at a label and you look at this label and you start questioning, like, is this really a 4-weight? This seems more like a 3-weight. Compare it with another 3-weight. Compare it with a 4-weight that you have and find out, because even though the label is saying it's the right yarn that your pattern's calling for, it really might not be. The other thing about yarn weight is the thickness of that yarn is going to make a huge difference on how stiff and structured or how drapey a project is. And some projects you want stiff and structured. Some projects you want really drapey. I want a shawl or a scarf to be very drapey. I want it to feel very luxurious and like hanging off of me. But when I made a couple hexagon cardies, I liked them a little bit stiff because I liked that shape of it feeling more like a jacket. And those thicker yarns are going to be a lot more stiff. They don't have the drape on their own like finer weights generally do. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule. There are exceptions to everything, but generally speaking, you are going to find if you are using a 4 or 5 weight yarn, it is not going to flow as much. The style of yarn you're using can make such a huge impact on your project. A really big example of this that I have struggled with is striped yarn, and I love the look of it in a cake. Absolutely love it. There's so many gorgeous ones, but for a lot of projects that I have made, I don't like how it turns out in the project. What I love striped yarn for is like a corner to corner blanket where you can see those stripes, they get to play out. I used a striped yarn in a mitered granny square blanket where, it starts out the square and it just keeps going. I love like how it looks in those like more like geometric style projects. But what I don't like striped yarn in is small projects, because the striping distribution is off. It's not symmetrical at all if it's too small of a project. You could have 3/4 of it in one color and 1/4 in another, and 2 colors you never used. It just is not real balanced for small projects. And for projects that you're working in the round, I have found with striped yarn, I have had a lot of unintentional color pooling where I get one side of the project that is real heavy in a couple colors and the other side of the project is heavy in the other colors. And it might not bother you at all, but for me, it's led to me not wanting to wear some of these projects because I didn't like how it looked. I felt as though it looked a little bit amateurish. I just wasn't confident wearing it because of how the stripes played out. And when I look at variegated yarn, oftentimes in the skein, I'm like, ooh, that is so busy. But guess what? Variegated yarn can look great in those projects that go in the round where you have much, much shorter bursts of color. It gets much more evenly distributed, especially for small projects. You know, that can work out great. So learning about these differences, you know, there's tonal yarn, there's speckled yarn, there's ombre yarn, which is a lot of times striped, but there's so many different options as far as the style of the yarn goes, and oftentimes it can make or break a project in the overall aesthetic and feel of it if you didn't pick the right one. So definitely learn how those play out. And if you're curious, you can always look and just type into YouTube or Pinterest or whatever, you know, the type of yarn you've got. Say it's a mandala cake, say you've got that, and like type in, you know, mandala yarn projects, things like that, and you can see how they look done up in different ways, just kind of based on how other people's looked. I mean, obviously it's not going to be exact or anything, but you'll get a good idea, like, you know, does this look better with stripes? Does this look better in the round? How is this going to work? If I am doing a cardigan, am I going to end up with color blocking? You know, all those things can make a difference. And while we're talking about that, color theory can be so important to learn. If you feel like you are struggling with your color combinations, watch some videos on color theory. Learn about colors that look good together. Learn about colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. Learn about colors that are opposite but look great together. Like, there's so much information out there, and you can really see, like, how will these work together? Which is one reason why I do like on the Knit Picks website, there's like an area of bundles on there where they have some of their most popular yarns like bundled together in different color groups. So if you're not confident and you feel like the color combinations you are picking out just are not working, maybe try something like that for the next few projects where, you know, you're dealing with a company that spent a bunch of money on research and development, knowing which colors to pair together, and then you can kind of defer that off to them until you become more confident with your own choices. You're going to want to familiarize yourself with how different stitches actually look worked up. I have made things and really thought when I got done, like, you know, this just looks basic. I should have used a more complicated stitch, or I should have used a smaller stitch so it would look more like knit, or like, there's all sorts of different things, but really look at how different stitches work up. And that's something, again, where you can look at other people's samples. I know this is a super simple example, but if you want to know what a beanie looks like in half double crochet versus double crochet, just type those in and look at them and see which ones appeal more to you, and see which one feels like it looks, I don't want to say better, but maybe it just looks more polished to you, or, you know, whatever the stitches are, it doesn't matter. And then one of the things that personally I have underestimated so many times, and it has led to disappointing projects for me, is not understanding the stretchiness of some stitches. It can make such a huge difference on the size of your project and how big it ends up getting, and if it ends up being too big. It's just really important. And again, a lot of this comes from that first example of setting aside time to practice. But I think that is something that gets overlooked oftentimes, but can oftentimes actually be what's to blame for ill-fitting and ill-sized projects. And I want to give you one example of something that is both practice and knowledge, and that's going to be to familiarize yourself with different patterns. And the reason you want to do this is, number one, so you understand them, but also, and probably equally as important, is that not all patterns are, how should I say this? Not all patterns are created equal. And I don't mean that as a dig on anybody at all, but some people have a lot of experience writing patterns. Some people have no experience writing patterns. Some people are using AI to write patterns and it doesn't really come up with anything at all. So familiarize yourself with patterns so that you know what's actually written well, so you can tell by looking at it if it makes sense to you or if it is something you are going to struggle with. I do advocate oftentimes for paying for patterns, especially in the beginning, which I know sounds almost like backwards. You're like, I'm just starting out and I don't know if I like this. I don't want to spend money. But here's the thing. If you're going to a source to purchase a pattern, generally speaking, that pattern has been tested. You can see how many sales it's had oftentimes. You can see the rating for it. You can see if the creator has made any type of clarifications that people are having. And that can be worth $5 alone or however much the pattern costs. Anyone can put a pattern on a blog or on YouTube. I mean, I've tried to write patterns and I don't know what I'm doing when it comes to writing patterns. Trust me. So if you can and you are really struggling, look for a well-rated pattern for the item you're trying to make and use that as your jumping off point, especially in the beginning. This is all a journey and this should be as fun and enjoyable as possible and with as little disappointment as possible. It does happen though. It does. It happens to everyone. So if it has happened to you, you are absolutely not alone. I look forward to talking yarn again with you soon. Bye.